Welcome back, guys, to another video in this Learning Computer Science educational series. Today we're going to be talking about basic web design, so let's start with the first slide. Document type and containers. So this is just a couple of the key elements that you will need to include in almost every HTML page. All HTML files must start with this exclamation point doc type HTML. This lets the browser know how to interpret the file. It lets it know that it is an HTML file. The next one is going to be the HTML tag. It is the root element which contains all HTML code. This is going to begin your file and end your file. So everything except for the doc type is going to be contained within the HTML tag. Think of it as like the buns of a hamburger. The body tag contains all visible HTML content. So all of the forms and inputs and divs and headers and text, all of that will be surrounded by the body tag. Lastly, we have the head element, and that is going to be right after the HTML tag, before the body tag. This contains stuff like metadata, the title of the web page, and any scripts. Next, we're going to talk about block level and inline containers. Block level takes up the full width of its parent element and starts on a new line. It also can have block level and inline level child elements. That just means you can place any element within any block level element, with some exceptions. Inline levels, on the other hand, take up only as much as is needed and stays on the same line. It can only have inline level child elements. You cannot put a paragraph element inside of an anchor tag element, for instance, because an anchor tag is inline and a paragraph is block level. So I'm not going to go through every single HTML element that exists. I'm only going to touch on the one that I deem the most important, being the form element. We are programmers after all. So a form element allows a browser to submit information to a specified URL. And the form element's attributes include an action attribute, which specifies the URL that the form data is sent to. It includes a method attribute, which specifies the HTTP request type, whether it's GET or POST. And lastly, we have enc type, which is not used as much, but it can still be very useful. It specifies how to format the data. So an example of this would be if I have a form that requires a photo upload, as well as a first name, a last name, an address, and a phone number. All those latter ones can be parsed as text. The photo, however, is different on a binary level, and it cannot be passed through a query string, so the enc type can specify, all right, I'm going to separate all this data so that I have one container for the image, one container for this name, and one container for the email. The form method default is get, and collects data in the form of a query string. So here's an example. We have test.com/form. And that question mark denotes that a query is going to be coming. So after the question mark is all the information that we accessed from the form. So here we have an ID equal to 10 and a name equal to John. The question mark denotes that the following is a query. It behaves as name equals value, and it is separated by an ampersand sign, that and sign there. The post method does not send information via the URL, but in the HTTP request body. It is still in the form of a query string unless otherwise noted by the enc type. So the reason for using a post method opposed to a get method is because the get method shows all the data in the URL. So if I'm passing a password or my bank PIN or something, we don't want that visible in the URL. We want that more hidden in an HTTP request body. Most likely an HTTPS request body so that it is encrypted for even more security. Let's go on to the next slide here. So now we're going to talk about CSS. We're done with HTML. The way that CSS works is you apply a style to a selected element, and sometimes you want to select a very specific element or a very specific group of elements. So here's a list of some of the selectors, and I have some more on the next slide. So if you use an asterisk, that selects everything on the HTML page. If you select the name of the element, it selects all elements of that kind. So P selects all P elements. If you select an element and then a space and then another element, that is all the elements that are descendants of the first selected element. What that means is if I have an anchor element nested inside a paragraph element, this selector would select that. Or even if I have an anchor element nested inside a div nested inside a P element, that is still a descendant of the P element. Now, if I wanted to be more specific, I can do P greater than A. And that specifically selects direct descendants. So in the first example, where A is a descendant of P directly, where it's just A inside of a P block, that is considered a direct descendant. If A is in a div, is in a P, while they are descendants of each other, they are not direct descendants because a div is in the middle. Next, we have this tilde. So we have P tilde A. That is all the A elements that are general siblings of a P element. So a general sibling would be like if I have a div filled with 3 P elements and an A element. Well, the A and the P are siblings because they are both children of that div element. They are both descendants of that div element. And P plus A, using the plus, is a direct sibling, and specifically the one that comes after. So I don't believe that there's any selector for a previous sibling. So if I have a div, and inside that div is 1 P and 2 A's, this P plus A would select specifically the first A that occurs, not the second A, because while they are siblings, they are not direct siblings. They're not nested right next to each other. If I use P and a comma and A, that's the same as writing one style for P and one style for A. I can create a list of all of the things I want to select by saying P, comma A, comma div, comma body. That selects all of those things. The comma is simply creating a list of what else do you want this style rule to affect. If I use something like dot and then a word, dot upper, the period specifies a class name. So if I use dot upper, it selects all elements with a class name of upper. If I use a hashtag, that selects all the elements with an ID of the specified name. Now we can get even more specific, not only choosing class and ID attributes. If we use these square brackets, we can select any attribute that we so choose. So here we have the A elements with a target attribute equal to underscore blank. And when we use this equal sign, it is a direct comparator. It's going to say, can I find any A elements where their target attribute is exactly underscore blank? If I use the tilde equals sign, like in this one, that's going to find all elements with an alt attribute that includes the word picture in a space separated list. And what it means by space separated list is, let's say my alt image was like picture space of space a space cat. So it's the sentence picture of a cat. Well, in a space separated list, I'd have picture of a and cat as my 4 space separated elements in that list. I can use an asterisk equals for any match. So you can imagine, if you're familiar with SQL syntax, the like operator has a asterisk. It's kind of like a wildcard, any. This is also true for many Linux terminals. So I find myself using this asterisk equals more than I use the tilde equals, but I thought I'd include it anyway. And the last one is going to be this caret equals sign. It returns all input elements with a class name that starts with valid. So let's say I have something like validator class, validate input, validate name, validate email. That would be valid for all of those. Let's go on to the next slide here. So the last couple of CSS selectors that I decided to include are the pseudo elements. : after adds content after the matched element, and before adds content before. So where I see this used most commonly is if you submit a form with improper data, then a red asterisk may appear, and the input box might be highlighted a certain color. You can do that with the after or before selector. So I can say all A elements are going to be blue, and then A : after, let's add a content of an asterisk with the color of red. Next we have first line and first letter. So first line is going to select the first line of text in whatever element that you choose, and first letter will select the first letter. And lastly, we have selection, which matches the currently highlighted text. CSS also has the ability to use variables. They must be set in this root selector with that syntax, and CSS variables have to begin with that double dash. And then if you want to call a CSS variable, you have to use the var function and then pass in the variable name. This can be very useful if you wanted to change just one line of text to change the color on a million style rules that you have. If you keep it in a variable, then you only have to change one thing. Lastly, we're going to talk about flex and grid properties. So these are 2 very useful CSS display properties. Grid uses a system of rows and columns to neatly organize your elements. Afterward, elements can be placed in grid cell squares by specifying the row column they belong in. So basically, you can think of your website as a container on a grid plane. And I can say, how many columns do I need and how many rows do I need? You can also have each element span a certain number of columns and rows. I find that grid is most useful if some planning was done and you can move your pieces exactly where you want in the very specific grid space. I find it very useful. Next, we have flexboxes, which arrange elements dynamically and allow for the wrapping of contents. Flexboxes can also easily align and space elements along the horizontal and vertical axes. I find that flexbox is one of the easiest ways to center an element if I'm having trouble with that. You can set a container as flexbox and then align items to center and justify content to center, where align items does the vertical movement and justify content does the horizontal movement. That's a good general rule of thumb. If you change the flex direction, align items and justify content can do unexpected things. So lastly, we're going to talk about JavaScript. JavaScript is dynamically typed, and there is no type included in a variable declaration. While it's not technically incorrect to write the line age equals 22, it's recommended that you use the keyword let or var. Let is pretty much standardized across all JavaScript programming now. Var is an older version. While it's technically not deprecated, you can still use it. Let is safer in most cases because of the scoping. For instance, I can't say let age equal 22 and then say let age equals 12 on the next line. With var, that is something that I could do. I could reuse the same variable name. It just leads to some unexpected behaviors. So because JavaScript is dynamically typed, arithmetic operations are treated specially. If I have my string equals the string representation of 6 and my number equals the integer 5, and I add them together, it will equal 11. So the JavaScript engine will interpret that string literal of 6 as an integer of 6 because the number 5 is already a number. In this other example where I have a string of John and an integer of 69, if I add those two together, it will cast the 69 as a string and add them up to the string John 69. And lastly, if I have two string literals, a string representation of 2 and a string representation of 4, if I multiply them, it will be 8. So both of those get casted to an integer because multiplication can't really be done with strings, right? So the nuance is with the addition symbol because that means string concatenation as well as adding two numbers. So that's just something to be mindful of. All right, we have a few more JavaScript rules that I'm going to continue with, and then we'll be done out of here. JavaScript functions take many forms. Here's 3 examples of how to make a JavaScript function. You have a classical function declaration where you use the keyword function. You give the function a name and some parameters, and then you write the function definition. You have an anonymous function expression where a variable can be set equal to a function. And then you have an arrow function expression, which is also anonymous, where you can set a variable equal to a function, but notice you don't have to use the function keyword at all. I find myself using arrow functions all the time because they're so fun. You get to make a little arrow with an equal sign. They're also useful when I'm knee deep in a function and I don't want to create another one. So I make an arrow function to do some manipulation to an array or something. And lastly, we're going to talk about Truthy and Falsy values in JavaScript. There's a few fun online JavaScript quizzes that give you these crazy questions and they say, is this going to be true or false at the end of this? So the basic rules are any non-zero number, non-empty string, objects, arrays, and functions, those are all truthy. Any null values, undefined, or not a number are falsy values. So I can say if my variable, right? I can just see if my variable, maybe I wanted it to be a number, and I can see, is this a number? If it returns NaN, then it'll be false. So there's a lot of shortcuts you can take with that because of the nature of truthy and falsy values in JavaScript. Let's go on to the last slide here. Bringing it all together. So JavaScript is capable of creating HTML elements, styling those HTML elements, and adding interactivity with JS. With these 3 languages, anyone can replicate any website. To run JS without the use of a browser, a JavaScript engine is required. There are multiple ways to achieve this, notably using Node.js. So if you guys want a Node.js tutorial in the future, I can definitely assist with that. But for now, I think we're going to give web development a break so that we can go on to more interesting stuff like database management, discrete math, version control. So that'll be it for today's episode. Leave a comment, let me know what you think, and make any requests for what I should make in the future. Thank you. Goodbye.